Well, hello, Mr. Stromberg here. We're going to have another art history lecture. We got some good images to look at today, interesting things to discuss here about advances in art in the age of Impressionism, mid 1800s to the late 1800s in France. And to do that, we're going to take a deviation here and talk about the influence, a very important outside influence on Impressionism. And that would be Japanese art. We haven't talked a lot about Asian art yet, and there's no mistaking that there is an enormous impact from Eastern art, particularly Japanese art, on Impressionism at this time for many reasons. You can look at the three slides we're going to look at today, and you can see one of the things that's common about them is a flatness. We talked last time about how in France the whole idea was to try to, certainly culturally, the whole idea was to make an image that was as realistic as possible. And in the age of photography, art had to take a different step. It had to make you feel something. Well, thanks to open trade routes with Japan and a cultural exchange that was happening, all of a sudden, this amazing Japanese art started to make its way to Paris. And the Impressionists saw the flatness of this Japanese art and saw it as something completely different than what was the norm in France, because it really is, as you'll see in a moment. And the result is this fascinating cultural exchange that happened. So let's talk about the first artist we're going to look at here today. This is Hokosai. Katsushika Hokosai is his name. Hokusai. Hokusai. Hokosai. Hokosai actually lived from 1760 to 1849. So we're going back a little ways in time. And in fact, he'd already passed away by the time a lot of this art had an enormous influence on people in Paris. This is the image that I want you to know. It's called The Great Wave. The Great Wave. Super famous image. I'm sure that you've probably seen it. It's everywhere today. You can buy it on handbags and reproductions and all kinds of objects. One of the more famous images you see in art history. And we'll come back to this in a moment. Things to know about Japan at this time, okay? So Japan's a fascinating place. It's an island, obviously, on the far side of the world from Europe. It took a long time for traders to get there. And from 1639 to 1858, Japan basically decided they were going to be isolationist. They were going to close themselves off from the outside world. They were not interested in outside influences. And so there's this whole visual tradition that kind of evolves separate from the rest of the world. That is not to say that outside influences didn't creep their way into Japan as well. So one of the main things you'll see is this beautiful blue color, which is present in the Great Wave and other images that I'll show you here today. And that actually is called Prussian blue, and it comes from Paris. So, you can tell just by the colors they were using that there were traders getting through, mainly Dutch traders who were trading with Japan and other countries in the Far East. But gradually, Japan starts to loosen this system of feudalism that they had, and there's this great opening of Japan to trade and to outside influence that happens around 1868, 1867. And all of a sudden, all these ideas start to come to Europe as a result of trade culture here. Let's look at a few images here. This is actually a drawing of a self-portrait of Hokosai here as an old man from one of his drawings here. So there you go. I always try to show you a picture of the artist whenever I can. So Hokosai is the most important and the most respected and famous of Japanese artists of an art form called ukiyo-e. Ukiyo-e, which is Ukiyo-e, ukiyo-e. That word means floating world. And there was this style in Japan from the 17th to the 19th centuries, ukiyo-e, where paintings and prints of everyday life and the interests of people. So things like nature and people in the environment. Sometimes scenes from stories, narrative stories, but they're printed, okay, just like books are printed, basically, okay. So they're meant to be produced and reproduced and then sold affordably to the people, okay. So there are many copies of these prints out there. And in a lot of ways, they are seen as the beginning of modern manga. Now, we think of manga or anime today. We think of, stylized Japanese characters, comic books, basically. That's where this starts. Manga is not a new tradition, even though it's absolutely enormous in pop culture at the moment and has been for a very, very long time. Some of you, I'm sure, are fan of Japanese cartoons or Japanese animation or manga, anime, comic books. That's where this starts. It starts with this tradition from ukiyo-e prints here. So let's go through a few of Hokosai's images here. One main series of prints that he made these between 1830 and 1832. It's called 56 Views of Mount Fuji. There's actually more than 36 views of Mount Fuji. There's more than 36 prints, but it's come down as 36 views. At the time, Hokosai was in his 70s, and he was at the absolute height of his career, and he made these beautiful images where he's really stretching what artists had done visually in order to show pictures of Mount Fuji and life in Japan around Mount Fuji. So here you can see Mount Fuji, and I just want you to notice the beautiful flatness to this image. This is made by, remember, it's a printmaking process. So he's just rolled that red ink, onto part of a plate in order to make, that red and gradually fade it into green ink there as part of the printmaking process. So there's a flatness that comes from making prints. I'll go through these kind of quick here, but you'll be able to notice Mount Fuji in each one. And notice how objects in this picture are tilted upwards in a way that shows a very different kind of perspective than we're used to seeing, and also a general flatness to the color. So the roof and the road, objects in the distance are all this pink color. That's because it's a print, and that's part of the printmaking process. But it leads to this, what we see today as a slightly cartoonish, stylized coolness, basically. Just try to put yourself in the mindset of a European who is coming from this incredibly academic, stuck-up perfection that's expected. Seeing these images, they couldn't possibly be any more different. There's Mount Fuji off in the distance here. And you also see just great care given to things like tree branches and these wonderful, intricate little drawings, and certainly the way he draws people. I'll show you some of his people in a moment here. Another cultural exchange that's happening, we not only have the Prussian blue and these beautiful rich blues in these images, but also there's a definite, you can tell Japanese artists have seen Western perspective as well. We'll be talking about perspective soon here in our class assignment. But things definitely are starting to get smaller in the distance, and you can see that there's the exchange goes both ways here. Here's Mount Fuji again, flat in space. Mount Fuji in the distance here. Look at these beautifully rendered trees and horse and these people here. Wonderfully cartoonish and intricate and fascinating little drawings. He was a master draftsman. And here we have the Great Wave. So what's so great about the Great Wave? Well, everything about this image is new and different. First of all, it shows nature dwarfing us. Okay, so you can see there's boats here with these sailors here hunkered down, about to get overtaken by this huge wave. There's Mount Fuji in the distance, by the way. But I want you to notice how stylized this wave is. Normal water, really, a thrashing wave certainly feels like this great wave, but it doesn't exactly look like this. This is the cartoonish equivalent. If you look, it's almost as if the white caps of the waves have these eagle talons kind of curling down. And that's, just a stylized repetition. It's this backward C form that repeats itself everywhere throughout the whole picture. And as a result, it becomes this hyper stylized, slightly cartoonish, just fascinating little drawing here. Only a couple of colors here, and you can see the dots of white kind of as the, water droplets suspended in the air. Anyway, also shows this cultural exchange with Prussian blue, and also the fact that the mountain is way far off in the distance. So there is a sense of Western perspective to it as well, even as everything is beautifully flattened out and stylized here. Extremely appealing image. We'll go quickly through the rest of Hokosai here, but he also created over many years, literally thousands and thousands of images. 15 different volumes of his art were published between 1814 and 1878, so years after his death, that are called today the Hokosai manga. And basically, these are the beginning of Japanese stylized illustration and cartooning, basically. Look at these sumo wrestlers warming up, just, how humorous they are. I mean, totally different than what we've seen in Western art at this time. Faces here, okay? Just stylized caricature faces of people as he's noticing them. Sometimes they're downright bonkers. Look at this image here, which is demonstrating a Japanese folk tale here, where you can see these characters' necks get elongated and stretched. Absolutely a crazy image. So intricately designed and just outside of anything that we've seen. You can imagine people's heads just kind of exploding, seeing the possibilities of doing such wildly creative, different things than what were being done in Western art at this time. This is not a Hokosai image, but I put it in here because it's one of my favorite ukiyo-e images by another really important Japanese artist named Tokoyashi. But look at this folktale here, where we have this gigantic stylized skeleton, hovering over top of these two samurai. I mean, even in modern illustration being done today, to have an image so intricate and visually engaging is rare. All that to say, cool things are happening in Japan, and it ends up as a result of trade routes being open right during the height of Impressionism here, the mid-1860s. All those ideas are now going to become known to people in Paris who, coincidentally at the time, are looking for ways to set themselves apart and do things that are different than what academic painting is all about. We talked last time about Edouard Manet and Edgar Degas changing up the way that they showed their images, flattening things out. And so that's what's happening. They're looking for something to grasp onto. All of a sudden, there's this amazing new art form, which is stylized and flat and fascinating, and it has a huge effect on art in Paris. So let's go back to Paris and talk about some more important Impressionist painters here, and you're going to see that influence of Japanese art. This is Mary Cassatt. Mary Cassatt. Cassatt. Mary Cassatt. And this is called The Boating Party. Mary Cassatt, The Boating Party. This is, by the way, just showing what you do, I guess, on a nice day. Off in Paris, you hire a boatman here to row you out to one of the islands in the Seine. Wear your parasol and or your sun hat and bring the kids and head out for the day. Maybe you can notice right off the bat how wonderfully flattened out this image is. It actually owes a lot to Japanese art, if you think about it here. If I asked you to paint a picture of a boatman rowing a woman and her child out in a boat, you would probably instinctually just put the whole boat in the middle of the frame and show me the sail and be able to see everything. Well, where does she put us? She puts us in the back of the boat, but flattens everything out. Look at that sail there. It's just a weird kind of off-white shape in the top corner. The yellow of the boat, that bright color, again, artists trying to pour super bright colors into their pictures that aren't traditionally used in flat ways. Well, the yellow of the boat almost looks like a capital E type shape there. And even the bits of water that we see in between the sail and the boat and up to the horizon line and off there in the distance are flattened and just kind of squiggles of blue. And where is the attention given to the faces of the mother and the child? The boatman himself is even flattened into somewhat of a dark, kind of flat black shape there. So, this is her experimenting with composition, very much the way that Degas did it with his ballerina dancers. You can remember him, composing things on a diagonal from corner to corner. She's a contemporary of his and is keenly aware they're all working together and meeting in cafes and, trying to decide as a group of outsider artists how to change art. And so she's keenly aware of that, and you can see that happening here too. And of course, that flatness is everywhere and works really, really well. The horizon line tipped way to the top there. We just see the far bank way at the top of the image. We don't even see any of the sky. So we should talk for a second about Mary Cassatt. Yes, I said Mary, so believe it or not, this is the first female artist that we've looked at so far. And that's kind of crazy, but it's true. This is not to say that there were not other important female artists earlier on in art history. There absolutely were. For example, Artemisia Gentileschi, Renaissance Italian artist. There were other artists who went by or used men's names. This happens in literature too, right? Where women were not supposed to become artists and writers in patriarchal societies like that, and so they had to sometimes use men's names and work under pseudonyms in order to get their work out there. Well, Mary Cassatt, this is the mid 1800s here, and this is she's a significant female figure, but also just an amazing painter in her own right. I mean, she was very much an equal to the other Impressionists in Paris at the time. She was an American, actually. She's from Pittsburgh. She, her family was fairly wealthy, and she had no desire to get married, settle down, and just fit into domestic life. She wanted to go out and to see the world and to create work, and so she moved to Paris, took her family's money, went to Paris, and lived in Paris, and immediately fell in with the Impressionist movement. Now, if Degas paints ballerina dancers, and he paints, he's fascinated with the movement and life and vitality of actors on the stage or ballerinas on the stage, and that's the theme that he paints over and over again. Cassatt, it's mothers and children, and she paints some of the most beautiful, intricate, and I think just kind of emotional connection between mothers and their children. And it's interesting because this is not a subject we see men instinctually wanting to paint very much. Oftentimes, if men are the painters, the women in the pictures are an object of their gaze, right? Think of all the awkward nudes that we've seen, or mythological paintings, right? That's when we see women. Well, now we have a woman who's attempting to just paint this really beautiful connection between a mother and her child here. So this is called The Bath. If you ever go down to the Art Institute of Chicago, you can see this image there. And it's just an amazing picture to get up close and see how she puts so much bright color into it. It doesn't really come across on a slide, but the flesh tones on the girl's feet there's bright pink and orange and purple, and somehow from a distance it looks quite realistic. Look how she's tilted the viewpoint up so that everything's flattened out, right? And also intentionally making things flat by packing those spaces with as much pattern as possible. So obviously the woman is wearing a striped pattern dress. We have the basin and the pitcher on the floor, which has a pattern on it. But then the bits of rug there, we have intricate pattern on the rug. We have a painted dresser in the back. We have wallpaper in the back. There is no empty space. Every bit of space has been intentionally flattened out with as much patterning as possible. That owes itself directly to the influence of Japanese art, with flatness. One of the fascinating things about Cassatt is that she actually did experiments where she tried to make her art look as Japanese as possible, and then pulled those things into her painting. So on the left here, you see a ukiyo-e image, okay, of a Japanese woman here, flattened out, drawn with this big dark line outlining things. There's really no sense of like realistic light or shade. It's cartoonish. And then on the right here, you can see Cassatt actually trying the same thing. So she's drawn here a woman addressing a letter, sitting at a dresser, and again, packing the background with this super detailed patterned wallpaper. The woman's dress is a patterned dress as well, so that it all is intentionally flattened out. And she's made it all in the same kind of print process here as Japanese print to try to make it look as flat as possible. Here's another one, a woman at a wash basin. Here, it's actually the same woman from the bath. If I flip back to that, you can see that same purple, white, and green gown there. And again, everything's tilted up and flat. Look at the perspective on that, the wash basin dresser there, you know, with those lines. Very little sense of light hitting it. Everything is flat. And obviously she's trying to make an image that looks as Japanese as possible right here. Here's another one. One of the fascinating things about her, you know, in all these beautiful pictures she paints over and over again of mothers and children, is there's just this quietness between them. You can see here bright, look at that incredibly bright green into the background, and the way that that green spills into the gown there along with blue. And another thing we haven't talked about yet, but is important for Cassatt and our next artist we'll talk about here, is that there are new advances in technology with paint at this time as well. So if you look at Renaissance painting, it can be bright, but only to a certain extent. All the colors are somewhat browned a little bit, and that's because in the 14 and 1500s, all the paints came from natural pigments, right? So if you want a certain brown, it's a rock that's found in the earth, ochre, that's crushed down to make this brown. If you want reds, yellows, blues, you have to find those things naturally in nature. That's why blues were so valuable during the time of Michelangelo, because they were only found in Afghanistan, and it was very rare, and only the richest people could get the deepest, darkest blues in their pictures. Well, now in Paris, there are new synthetic paints being made. So that incredibly bright, almost kind of neon green in the background here, that's a synthetically made color now, which is much brighter than typical colors that were available to artists before this time. And of course, it coincides perfectly with Impressionists wanting to add more color to their pictures to increase the emotional effects of bright colors in their pictures. And also, they wanted to add more colors because academic painting was meant to be more realistic, more muted, more brown and gray. And now they can add these incredibly bright, brilliant colors that kind of take your eyes by storm. The other thing to talk about with Cassatt and with all of these painters too is the way that they're applying the paint. We talked about this with Monet and Degas as well, but I mean, just look at this. I love this painting right here, this beautiful interaction between this mother and child here. But look behind them. Look at the child's feet. Look how the dress kind of starts to de-evolve there at the bottom of the picture. She's put all this attention and detail to the faces, okay, of the mother and the child here, also to the hand of the child there. And then everything else very much is left rough and unfinished. Again, this is the kind of thing that would have been seen at the time as, incomplete. And like when you start a painting, you're supposed to rough it in, but you're supposed to kind of smooth everything out and perfect everything. And she's intentionally left all of these kind of quickly drawn, sketchy blobs of paint around the outside edge so that there's a lot of energy in the way that a paint's been applied. Look at the white, behind the child's head, or the way that the picture behind the mother's head there. You can actually sense of how quickly it was put down. In leaving it unfinished, it's not leaving it. It's not about leaving it unfinished. It's about leaving that paint mark, which is quickly applied and has a sense of energy and feeling to it. And again, what are the Impressionists trying to do? They're trying to make people feel something rather than just showing them here the picture of the mother and child. They're trying to make them feel something. And Cassatt's really good at that. By the way, this is something that Rembrandt did a lot. If you remember all the way back to Rembrandt, painting the faces with extreme care and then loosening the paint in other areas of the painting which aren't as important as the two images you immediately look at, the faces of the two people. So you can express a lot with the way that the paint is actually applied. So there you go. That's Cassatt, The Boating Party. So we have Hokosai's Great Wave, Cassatt's The Boating Party, our third image today, and last of our Impressionist painters we're going to talk about is Monet, Claude Monet, M-O-N-E-T, Claude Monet. And this is called Water Lilies, Water Lilies. Claude Monet, Water Lilies. And I'll show you a picture of Claude Monet. There he is, a much later photograph of Claude Monet, early 1900s here. So Monet very much present with the others we talked about, particularly Degas and Cassatt and there are many other Impressionist painters, by the way, who we're not going to have the chance to look at, but others who were all working together at this time. The word Impressionism actually came about as kind of an insult that an art critic wrote about one of these art exhibitions that the Impressionists had. He kind of said these aren't really paintings; they're just impressions, or these Impressionists. He dubbed it more as a derogatory thing, and instead the Impressionists saw that and thought, oh, this is brilliant, and over time it's become known as Impressionism. So when a lot of people think Impressionism, they think Claude Monet, because he did an enormous amount to advance the idea of physical change to art at this time. And he's probably the most well-known of the Impressionist painters, super popular painter today with people who know nothing about art, seem to know who Claude Monet is. So have a look at Water Lilies here. The one thing Monet did was obviously bumped color up to extreme levels in his pictures, super bright, but also really felt, as he was painting, and he often painted outside. So here you have a picture, looking down into his little pond with water lilies here, okay? He would paint what's called plein air painting, or out in the air. And he was a mad scientist of color. The whole point of what he was doing was to try to capture the exact tone of the atmosphere or the light on a given day and give you a feeling like you're there witnessing it. So to look here at his pond here, you'll see if you strain your eyes and look close at those lily pads, they're kind of little blobs of color. They're not really refined at all, but yet he has little bits of purpley blue, down at the bottom of the picture. There's little bits of pink in there and all kinds of other tones, all placed not as solid colors, but as little dabs or blobs of paint, so that everything kind of pulsates with energy. And that was his whole idea, right? To give you an impression of what you're seeing, or a feeling of being there, in particular how it looks at a specific time of day. So when you think about painting an object like lilies in a lily pond here, what's fascinating about it is it's going to look completely different, at any time of day, as the sun moves above you, or as clouds come in or leave, right? Artists talk about this time called the golden hour, which is right away in the morning, or right as the sun is going down in the afternoon, where the sun is low and you get this bright, brilliant gold color. Those are all going to change. And so Monet is fascinated with the way that something as simple as the view down into a pond here can really emotionally impact you if you can absolutely nail the color at a specific time of day and a specific atmospheric effect. Look how abstract this image looks. Actually, we can tell we're looking into the pond because these clumps of lily pads get smaller in the distance, and we can see the reflection of the opposite shore, but mainly we're seeing the reflection of the sky kind of upside down around these lily pad blobs. When you think about it, very abstracted image, yet it also, for a selected viewpoint, feels exactly like what it's supposed to be there, staring down into the pond. Totally different way of making art. Now, Monet was heavily impacted by Japanese art as well. If you don't believe me, look at this early Monet picture here. This is a picture of his wife Camille here in a Japanese kimono. It was extremely fashionable in Paris, and kind of the best way to show that you were wealthy in Paris at this time was to walk around in the 1860s, 70s, 80s here wearing a Japanese kimono, because it proved that you could afford, this beautiful silk garment traded all the way from the far side of the world. It had a huge impact outside of art as well, on fashion and all kinds of other areas as well. Certainly objects that were being traded and other goods too. So here he is, clearly impacted by that as well. And he was part of that, tradition that saw flatness and new viewpoints, in ukiyo-e prints as enormously impactful too. Here's another early Monet image here of the Gare Saint-Lazare train station in Paris, and just look at the way that he paints those blobs of smoke coming out of the train here, or also these people down there on the platform. I mean, they're just little black squiggles, and yet it almost looks quickly kind of, you can sense how quick he painted it, and that's kind of the point, right? He's giving you an impression or a feeling of being there in this dirty Parisian train station. Early images, by the way, of all these painters usually have less color because that was more the norm at the time, right? To paint with less color and to paint more muted. And, as they started to push the boundaries, those colors get really bright. So one of the things that Monet would do is he would pick a subject and just paint the same thing over and over and over again at different times of day in order to show you how the color changes. And this is fascinating because, he's a very prolific artist, thousands and thousands of paintings. You can go to museums around the world and see Monet images. And oftentimes, if they're lucky, they'll have the images that he painted of one subject, next to each other, but slightly different. So you'll see a room of haystacks, which we'll look at in a moment here, or in this case, the front facade of Rouen Cathedral in France. So just imagine him early in the morning having, 5 or 6 empty canvases all ready to go, and taking those canvases out, and along with his lunch and his easel, and sitting outside and starting when the sun comes up, painting a picture, and then, a couple hours later, setting that canvas off to the side, taking the other one, painting it again, and basically painting it 5 or 6 times in a day. And he would often do this sort of thing because he was so fascinated with the way that color worked. So here you see the front face of the cathedral in the early morning with that beautiful golden sun hitting it. Look how the shadows become bright red there in the center, that patch of blue in the sky. Here we have the same facade of the cathedral. Okay, I'll flip back and forth between them, but you can see how now the sun is, gone high up in the sky or behind it. Possibly a cloud has come over, so that those strong shadows don't exist anymore. Anyway, you get the idea. Here's the whole cycle of cathedral paintings that he made, and you can see how the colors vary. And, he's just absolutely fascinated with trying to, make you feel what it's like to be there at a different kind of day, time of day, to capture the essence of what those colors look like as they come from that object to your eye based on the color of the light and location of the sun, warmth of the day. Anyway, that's what he's fascinated with. They've studied his palettes, by the way, which is just the the big surface where he mixed his paint, and he was truly a mad scientist of color. The sheer amount of paints that he used, and again, brand new paints that are available for the first time in the late 1800s here, allowing for artists to have brighter access to color than they've ever had before. Haystacks is a big one. He used to go out into the countryside and set up for the day and just paint these stacks of hay and these beautiful scenes outside. You can just imagine him out there with his easel. Look at this one here, these haystacks, again at the golden hour. Just how many incredibly bright colors are in these piles of hay. Bright red, bright green, fluorescent green almost, fluorescent blue, and of course gold. And you feel the warmth of a summer afternoon here as you're looking at these inanimate piles of straw. Here's another one. There are many, many haystack images. You can go look them up, but look how the shadows become, bright blue, bright purple, wonderfully expressive, and, something as simple as a pile of hay here. You feel an emotional connection to it because of that bright color. There's something in us that really enjoys bright, beautiful colors too. And I think that's why today his paintings are still enormously popular. People just flock to Monet because they're very likable images. They speak to us on a subconscious level through their use of color. He painted many, many series of different objects, and so the water lilies image I showed you earlier is only one of many water lilies, if you're trying to look it up to drag that image into your notes. Here's another one where you can actually get a sense of the kind of muddiness in the water here. It's a little more brown, but you can actually see the grass on the far bank here. Again, this limited view looking down into his lily pond here. He had this huge estate, which is still there, north of Paris. It's called Giverny, about 45 minutes away from Paris, and I've never visited, but I know some people have, and you can go to the lily pond and you can look down into it, and it still very much looks the same way, which is pretty cool. A few others here. He did spend time in London and travel around as well. So here we actually have the Houses of Parliament over the river. You can almost sense the smog in the air here as the sun is going down here. And we just get this, sense of the sun dancing off the water with these bright orange, yellow, and magenta streaks there. And then the outline of the Parliament House there, London Parliament, seen as this bright, brilliant blue. And I've always been drawn to this image here because it's just a fascinating example of how color can make you feel something, even if the execution, it just shows how if the color's right, it can make you feel something, even if the image itself is a fairly strange image. So maybe you've had the opportunity to see the sun look like this. You often see it in Minnesota in the wintertime when it's kind of a hazy, super cold day, and the sun is setting about 5 o'clock at night, and if it's low enough in the horizon, there's enough kind of haze in the air, you can actually look at the sun without it burning your retinas out, and you can see this just perfectly pale pink dot for the sun, even as the sky around has this brownish hue to it. And that's what he's managed to capture here, like perfectly. Just imagine him obsessing over that specific color. Evidence here for why it's such an amazing painting. He gets the colors so right in the sky and how they affect the ships in the distance here and the water and everything, that if you actually look at the way that he's painted that boat in the foreground there, that dark boat with the boatman, it's just little squiggles, or the outline of the ships and the shipyard there in the distance, again, just little quick squiggles, but the color is absolutely perfect to the point where it convinces you that you're there, even if the he doesn't have to have the rest of the image be perfect at all, because the color is so accurate to the impression you get being there and viewing that. Leave you on Monet here with another series that he did many images of called the Japanese Footbridge. And just to bring it full circle today to the Japanese influence on Impressionism, he had this little footbridge installed in his garden at Giverny. So this is the lily pond below. And it's still there today, and he painted this over and over and over again as well, a series of the Japanese footbridge. And this comes directly from all these famous ukiyo-e prints. There's often an image of this beautiful arched bridge over top of water or in the midst of nature. And remember that a key part of a lot of those prints was nature kind of dwarfing people. And so Monet was, a huge fan of that as well, subject-wise, of just the beauty of nature, as we've seen here by some of the images that he did. Here's one of his last images of the footbridge from time before his death, and you can see how he's just cranked the colors up enormously here. And this is leading the way towards artists in the next couple weeks who are really creating modern art in a lot of ways and infusing color we've never seen before. So we'll be talking quite a bit about crazier color going forward. Finally, there are many different water lilies, as I suggested, including images like this. This is actually the Louvre in Paris, and one of his staggering accomplishments here was to rethink about how a painting could actually fit into a space and what it could do. Does it always have to be a rectangle or a square? He actually made some of these water lily pictures on curved canvases, or in this case, designed them as these huge curved murals to go in an oval-shaped room, so that when you stand in the middle of the room and look around, you almost get a 360-degree immersive IMAX kind of experience of looking down into the pond. It's pretty obsessive. It shows just kind of how crazy he was to try to figure out exactly how to show what he wanted to express, capture the impression of that pond. But it meant that much to him. He was extreme perfectionist in trying to capture that. So that's Claude Monet, and if anything today, I hope you notice the impact of flatness, okay, from Japanese art, and also the just wonderful expressive quality of of objects in Japanese art, and the effect that that had on Impressionism. Think about the things we looked at last time, and the monumental leap forward that happens as part of that cultural exchange. Thanks for paying attention, and we'll talk to you next time.